By moonlight, the shadows grow long, and creatures we thought were only stories begin to stir. From the howls of werewolves to the whispers of vampires, humanity has long feared what might lurk in the dark. Being afraid of the dark is an evolutionary feature, not a bug. In the darkness, predators could hide, unseen dangers could strike, and the unknown loomed. Our ancestors created myths and stories to explain these fears, giving shape to the monsters they imagined lurking in the shadows. But these creatures, werewolves, vampires, or ghosts, reflect deeper societal anxieties. Fears of losing control, crossing moral boundaries, or facing the inevitability of death. They're a mirror to our psyche, revealing what we fear most about ourselves and the world around us.
I just saw Nosferatu last week and really scratched a niche for gothic, atmospheric horror and fantasy, which has been kind of neglected in mainstream media lately. I also heard of a new Frankenstein movie being directed by Guillermo del Toro, which sounds excellent. So this really inspired me to talk about the topic of the video today. We already talked about creature design in the past, as you can see in the cards. And we also talked about dark fantasy and a little bit about gothic fantasy inside that video. We haven't explored yet creatures of the night in specific, which have been present in stories and media for centuries. So what do they represent? And why do, as humans, feel the need to create these monsters with our imagination? This is what I want to explore today, so let's get to it.
Humans are wired to fear the unknown. It's a survival instinct that's been with us since the dawn of time. Darkness symbolizes the ultimate unknown, hiding dangers we can't see or prepare for, like predators or unseen threats. For our ancestors, the night was a matter of life and death. To make sense of this fear, they created myths, stories that gave the unknown a face. You know the classics, a howling werewolf, a lurking vampire, or a restless ghost. These myths were survival tools, cautionary tales that kept communities alert and aware. And I guess our primate brains haven't evolved enough to lose the fascination of exploring horror in a controlled environment. Before science, myths filled the gaps in understanding. Strange behaviors or unexplained deaths were often attributed to supernatural forces. Disease might have been blamed on a vampire's curse, and animal attacks could become the work of a werewolf. These stories weren't random, they often came with moral lessons. A myth about a vengeful ghost might warn against betrayal, while a tale of a cursed shapeshifter could caution against greed or arrogance. Myths not only explained the world, but also reinforced societal values, ensuring people acted in ways that kept the community safe and cohesive. I just started rereading Mary Shelley's Frankenstein recently, and it is a great example of a myth that fits this theme. Though not a traditional creature of the night, Frankenstein's monster embodies humanity's fear of the unknown and our anxieties about playing God. Shelley wrote the novel during a time when science was rapidly evolving, and people were both fascinated by and terrified of its potential. The monster represents the consequences of unchecked ambition and the fear of creating something we can't control. It's a modern twist on the cautionary tale, showing that even as our understanding of the world grows, we still use stories to grapple with our deepest fears.
Even today, these ancient fears still speak to people, which is why myths about creatures of the night continue to thrive in modern fantasy and fiction in general. Werewolves remind us of our fear of losing control, ghosts haunt us with guilt and unresolved trauma, and vampires embody the allure and curse of immortality. So all these stories, they tap into universal themes: fear of death, the monstrous other, and just the overall fragility of our humanity. The media sometimes can be horror movies, supernatural dramas, or gothic novels. These creatures continue to evolve, adapting to reflect the anxieties and challenges of each generation, while remaining rooted in those primal fears of the unknown. Next, the idea is to go over some of the most notorious examples of these creatures. But before we do that, just a quick reminder that we have a free Discord channel. It's called Loregeist Tavern. It's a place for fantasy discussion, writing, and world building. Feel free to join if that sounds good to you. And let's carry on with the video.
Now, I wanted to go over some of the most classic examples of these creatures. Of course, our understanding of them evolved with the natural evolution of media, but I want to understand what they really represented in their conception, and what kind of themes you can explore you choose to write about them. Let's start with werewolves They have been lurking in the shadows of human imagination for centuries, with their earliest mentions dating back to Greek mythology. The tale of Lycaon tells of a king who dared to defy Zeus by serving him human flesh, leading the enraged god to transform him into a wolf, a punishment that cemented the connection between werewolves and moral transgression. Fast forward to medieval Europe, and werewolves took on an even darker role, often linked to witchcraft and the devil. These were the days of witch trials and superstition, where accusations of werewolf transformations could lead to gruesome punishments. The werewolf became a symbol of fear, representing the unknown, but also the danger of stepping outside societal norms. Werewolves first howled their way into fiction in the 19th century, gaining romanticized elements in Gothic literature. Clemens Hausmann's The Werewolf from 1896 portrayed the creature as mysterious and alluring, laying the groundwork for its dual nature as both predator and victim. By the 20th century, Hollywood cemented the werewolf's place in pop culture with films like The Wolfman, which introduced key tropes like the transformative power of the full moon.
So, werewolf stories, they pretty much come down to our fear of losing control and of the beast within us all. These stories, they embody the struggle between human rationality and animalistic instincts and impulses. And that creates a compelling duality that's usually easy for the audience to identify with. Are we civilized creatures, or there's something primal lurking beneath the surface? This theme has made werewolves enduring symbols in media.
Vampires are another big staple. They have been haunting human imagination for centuries, and nearly every culture has its version of these blood-sucking creatures. In Slavic folklore, there's the strigoi, restless spirits that drink the blood of the living. In China, the jiangshi, also known as hopping vampires, suck life energy instead of blood and are kept at bay by sticky rice. Meanwhile, the Greek vrikolakas terrorize towns, often tied to improper burials or curses. Vampires became a metaphorical goldmine for Victorian-era fiction, where they represented fears of repressed sexuality, moral corruption, and the spread of disease. Bram Stoker's Dracula used vampirism as a way to explore forbidden desires, with Dracula preying on his victims in ways that felt both horrifying and intimate. By the 20th century, Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire redefined vampires as romantic anti-heroes, focusing on their eternal loneliness and moral dilemmas. Movies like The Lost Boys gave vampires a rebellious rock and roll edge, while Buffy, the Vampire Slayer, brought them into the realm of teen drama. The modern era saw the explosion of vampire romance with Twilight, The Vampire Diaries, and True Blood, proving that vampires could evolve from predators to heartthrobs while still being captivating.
So, vampires are always a fascinating mix between allure and horror. Of course, with vampire stories, you explore themes of immortality as both a blessing and a curse. What does it mean to live forever? Watching the world change while you stay the same. Vampires also tap into humanity's fear of death and the seductive pull of forbidden desires. So they often tie to themes of sexuality and otherness.
The Banshee is one of the most iconic figures in Irish folklore, known as the wailing spirit who foretells death. Her name comes from the Irish meaning fairy woman. According to legend, she appears to warn noble Irish families of an impending death, either as a ghostly old hag or a stunning woman with long, flowing hair. Her mournful keening, an eerie, wailing cry, is said to chill the soul and is tied to Ireland's tradition of keening as a mourning ritual during funerals. The Banshee isn't malevolent. Instead, she serves as a somber reminder of mortality, embodying the inescapable reality of death.
So, Banshee pretty much represents the inevitability of death, but the role goes beyond just fear of it. She's often seen as a protector of sorts, tied to familial bonds. So the idea is her warnings allows families to prepare for the loss of a loved one, making her a figure of grief and also acceptance rather than just like sheer horror. So her connection with death and mourning rituals make her like a deeply human mythological figure. It's also a reflection of how human beings should cope with loss and the fragility of life. So the Banshee, it's also grounded in cultural traditions of the Irish that still going on across generations. The way the culture approaches the loss of a loved one, pretty much. In fiction, she can serve as a metaphor for unresolved grief and as a symbol of ties between family members and how much it hurts when they are broken.
Ghosts have been a part of human storytelling for as long as we feared what happens after death. Nearly every culture has its own version of spirit, from the restless Kai of ancient Egypt to the vengeful ghosts of Mesopotamian myths. These tales often revolved around unresolved trauma or improper burials, spirits lingering because something was left undone, or they were denied the respect owed to them in death. Ghosts were a way to make sense of grief, guilt, and the mysteries of the afterlife. Ghosts found a home in Gothic literature, where they often symbolized personal and societal anxieties. Henry James's The Turn of the Screw is a masterclass in psychological horror, leaving readers questioning whether the ghosts are real or a product of the governess's mind. Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House explores how a house itself can become a vessel for fear and trauma, themes that were later adapted into the Netflix series of the same name. And let's not forget the Victorian era, where seances and spiritualism became a cultural obsession, making ghost stories a fashionable way to explore mortality and the unknown. Ghosts are timeless because they force us to confront what we fear most, the possibility that some things never truly end.
So essentially, ghost stories are about fears and regrets we carry and we associate with death. Unresolved guilt that stems from someone passing away, spoken truths, also from the same reason. These elements can haunt both the living and the dead. So ghosts are pretty much powerful metaphors of these lingering effects of unresolved issues after death. The idea is always to show how the past refuses to stay buried.
The Wendigo comes from Algonquin folklore and is one of the most chilling creatures in indigenous mythology. It's a malevolent spirit tied to themes of starvation and greed, often described as a once human figure who turned into a monster after resorting to cannibalism during harsh winters. This transformation was also moral, a reflection of insatiable hunger and the loss of humanity. The Wendigo has crept into many horror and fantasy stories, often as a symbol of primal fear and moral decay. Stephen King brought the Wendigo myth into modern horror with Pet Sematary, where it lurks in the woods, corrupting the land and those who venture too far. The creature also appeared in The X-Files, terrifying audiences in its eerie, cannibalistic form. More recently, the Wendigo took center stage in the psychological horror game Until Dawn, where its monstrous appearance and tragic backstory explored the consequences of survival at any cost. In the 2021 film Antlers, the Wendigo was reimagined as a towering, skeletal creature tied to themes of abuse and generational trauma.
The Wendigo is a warning about the dangers of greed and losing our humanity in the face of desperation. So this creature has insatiable hunger, and it reflects our fears of excess and the cost of taking more than we need. So usually you're going to see Wendigos in settings that are talking about survival, isolation, and guilt. The guilt that comes from doing anything you need to survive. Some people also argue that the Wendigo is a criticism to colonialism. So they interpret the creature as symbolism to the colonizers exploiting the indigenous lands. Pretty much you can see Wendigo as a powerful horror figure, but also a lens to explore societal greed and its consequences. And that comes from environmental destruction until moral decay.
Humans have always been haunted by the fear of death and the unknown, and creatures of the night are a perfect way to explore that. These myths help us grapple with questions we can't fully answer. What happens after we die? What lies beyond what we can see? Werewolves, vampires, ghosts, and banshees bring these fears to life, giving them shape and meaning. They are reflections of the questions and anxieties that have followed us through history. These creatures help us face our deepest fears in a way that's both terrifying and oddly comforting, because they offer a way to make sense of the unknown.
Yeah, so there you have it. So creatures of the night could be much more than just spooky tales and horror and fantasy tropes. They can be used in your story as windows through our deepest fears. They can reflect our anxieties, and also explore what it means to be human. These creatures, they tap into universal truths, but they also evolved over the centuries to reflect modern anxieties. And they still hold some power to fascinate, terrify, and inspire. So that's it for the video today. Before we go, I'll mention our Discord server again. It's called Loregeist Tavern. And it's a place to talk everything fantasy. It's in the comments or the channel page, and it's completely free. So just let me know in the comments which creatures of the night captivate you the most. And as always, thanks for watching and see you next time.
Come join our Tavern discussion of fantasy storytelling and world building here at Loregeist. Give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications. Thanks for watching, and may your tales be ever epic.